want to know which planet was causing your suffering? How about Earth?
Hey everyone, Brandflex here, back with a new Shadowverse 2 video. For today's video, I want to go over my version of the tier list at this current point in the patch. I guess patch is assuming that side games will nerf or buff some cards, but I kind of doubt that'll happen. So I guess this is probably more accurate to say that this is my tier list of the current snapshot of the meta. Keep in mind that I'm really only a Roach player, and I haven't played much Carbuncle Roach, but I've been watching a lot of gameplay. Like I watch Dion stream, I watch Spicy stream, I watch a lot of English streamers as well. So my opinion isn't perfect because I am mostly like a fairy mid-range / fairy aggro player. So it's a lot of like me assuming things and me guessing things, and that'll end up being why some of the deck lists I'll like have a name on there, but they probably won't be the perfect deck list, with the exception of Aggro Sword, which I took basically directly from Spicy's. And he played the same list for like a few days, and he's been maintaining 75% win rate. So I'm assuming it's a pretty good list. So I'm hoping that one at least is accurate, but everything else is pretty like wishy-washy. So these are pretty loosely sorted. Ironically enough, the rows that these decks are on are pretty indicative of how the tiers are formed. So tier 0 is the top row, tier 1 is the second row, and then like tier 1.5 is the third row. And I guess 1.5, 1.5 is a bit generous for Ramp Dragon, but I'll explain the tiers more precisely. And it's important to note that these are decks that have gotten some major-ish change with the patch. Carbuncle Roach is actually the one deck that didn't really get a major update, besides like Titania and Lamaga, but it's changed a little bit enough, and Carbuncle Roach was the dominant deck from last set, so I'm putting that here just because I think it's still the strongest deck. And Aggro Forest is probably the one that's actually like been enabled by the new set, but Carbuncle Roach again, strongest, so I'm going to put that there. So going off the top of the tier 0 ranking, Aggro Abyss, I think objectively speaking, Aggro Abyss is probably actually more like tier 1 in terms of raw deck strength. The reason why I have it at top of tier 0 is purely because ladder is the major form of content we have in Shadowverse 2, so therefore on ladder alone, I believe Aggro Abyss is the strongest deck, just because you cycle through games so often. And if you look at the rankings, which I'll just go ahead and do just to prove my point, if you look at the rankings, you'll see that the top 3 people in Master Points are all Aggro Abyss players. And again, that's not to say that like Aggro Abyss is, I mean, I think it's like literally like all the top players are Aggro Abyss. And it's not to say that Aggro Abyss is the best deck in the game, it's just the fastest deck, and it has a strong win rate despite being that fast. So it's not the highest win rate by far. I think that tile goes to Aggro Sword or Hybrid Rune, but it is just by far the most efficient if you're trying to maximize your master points with the amount of time you have. So Aggro Abyss is pretty simple. You play on curve, you try and hit the face as much as you can. If you ever trade, you have to make sure it's a trade that delays you from dying or prevents your opponent from wiping your board for free, because otherwise every point of damage should be directed into your opponent's face. And obviously, playing Aggro Abyss, a lot of your cards have Storm in some way. Like Exela is a Storm unit. You have a lot of Ghost Generation, which is a Storm. Mummy will have Storm after a while because of your Shadow stacks coming up. Argavi, Balto, Odin, they all deal damage straight to the face. And Barrel obviously is just a very efficient minion to play on curve or point out. And then with Arl and Winged Servants, you even have ways to get more bats to heal. So essentially, you're just kind of hoping you hit curve, and you're hoping your opponent doesn't hit the responses they need to deal with their board. And you shouldn't hit face as efficient as you can. You want to make sure your card resource expenditure maximizes your face damage and also maximizes damage efficiency over like a 5-turn period. That 5-turn period being turns 1 through 5. Pretty straightforward deck. I think the deck is I say relatively cheap, looking at 3 Odin, 3 Argavi, and 2 Olivia. But Olivia is flexible. You can take Olivia for some other cards, but I do think that 3 Argavi, 3 Odin is non-negotiable. So this deck is not that pricey. Like you need 6 legendaries, but the other like 7 and 8 are kind of optional, so it could be okay for a new player to play. The next deck I'm going to talk about in tier 0, I think this deck is arguably the best deck in the game. I think Aggro Sword and Hybrid Rune are very, very close in efficiency, but I think Aggro Sword has less holes to deal with, or like has less holes to poke at which means that it's more consistent. And also, since it's an aggro deck, your games are also quite a lot faster than Hybrid Rune. And since you're the one with all the proactivity, obviously you can still brick with Aggro Sword, but because of the new set giving you so many more storm cards and so much more efficiency, it ends up being like you can just maybe, like, even if you lose all your tempo early on, if turns 5, 6, 7, 8, you kind of get lucky with how your opponents have drawn, you can still win games that you probably don't deserve to win because of all the storm you have access to. So yeah, as aggro deck, you're going to be playing Flash Step Quickblader. This one drop, if you go first, adds up 3-4 damage for 1 mana very easily if you're playing against anything that has to have a board to clear, or if you're playing against a Rune that doesn't have a early Storm Blast. Ignominious Samurai is just a good clear. Seria is an extremely powerful addition to this deck because of another new card, Rose. If you play Rose on turn 5 and then you draw into Seria, you can actually execute a really large board as a... Not really execute, but you can fish out a really efficient board clear as Sword that you didn't have access to in the previous set. Like in the previous set, you just have to play Luminous Magus, Evo, and Prey. But now if your opponent has like a few 1 health minions and you have Rose, or even just like 1 health and 1 big minion, you can Rose and execute the other minion and sell a board that they have to respond to. Or else you're going to be able to get more chip damage, which obviously leads into Odin, Albert, Ravening Tentacles, and Centurion range. So this deck does still have to play for board. You do still have to understand how to pace yourself to get the most damage out. Like, for example, should I Evo Vals preemptively? Should I save the Evo for Vals? Should I Evo a Hound to keep it alive for next turn or to get a better kill? There are a lot of nuances with how you should be spending your resources to maximize your effect. But this deck is pretty straightforward because it is just an aggro deck at the heart of it, like an aggro tempo deck. And you can always just watch Spices for faster learning if you want to get this deck up to par as quickly as possible. The next deck in Tier 0, I think the third deck in Tier 0 rather, is going to be Hybrid Rune. Side Games outdid themselves with giving Rune a lot of extra power. Basically what they did was they printed this card called Norman, who essentially gives... If you play all 3 of him and heal, Norman is literally more than an extra health bar for Runecraft. And due to his flexibility, he doesn't even just have to be an extra health bar. He can even proactively block damage with Barrier Guardian Golems, and that really stumps a lot of decks that want to either pop you with Storm units like Roach, like Sword, or decks that want to chip you over time to get you slowly into lethal range like Abyss and, again, like Sword and Forest. So Norman just giving Runecraft a lot of HP helps them stall for a very, very long time, which allows them to then get to their endgame of Cocytus Climb, which obviously is notorious because with Rule of Cocytus, you play him at 10 mana, and then Rune's the only class in the game that can immediately draw 5 cards for 0, which lets you fish for stuff like Astaroth or Silent Riders or Spawn of whatevers that deal more damage. So Rune is a class that had a problem last set because you could die really early, and to be fair, you can still die very early to aggro, but because they've made your turn 5 a lot more stable, they essentially doubled the amount of good cards you can draw to stabilize on turn 5. And then they made the turn 6 also twice as stable because now you don't have to have double Angrea in order to have a good time on 5 and 6. Now you can have Angrea or Burgent, and on turn 6 you can have Angrea or Burgent or Norman. So they made Rune significantly more consistent. They made Rune consistently more tanky because of Norman, and they made Rune... they made the early game of Rune a lot better as well because now you can actually actively play these cards that will give you Earth Sigils to prep your Norman. And this gives you more early board presence because that means that you can actually play for the board early and you won't be super punished, because if you somehow don't draw any card draw, well, Norman is card draw, worst comes to worst. Like, you can always refill your hand with Norman if you get quote-unquote unlucky. Otherwise, you still have all the basic, like, deck cycle through Witch's Brew, deck cycle through Melvi because she adds Witch's Brew, deck cycle with Homework Time, deck cycle with Norman, and deck cycle with Dimension Climb. Like, there's a lot of ways to still cycle your deck out, and this is by no means, like, the most efficient Rune deck that exists. This is just what I think I see a lot when people play Rune, and obviously it could be tuned up a little bit better. But yeah, Rune is being super notorious right now. It's like by far the most disgusting deck, in my opinion. So disgusting that the deck that I hated by far the most last set, Artifact Portal, is actually now bumped mentally down to tier 1. I guess it's more accurate to say this is like tier 0, tier 0.5, and then like tier 1.5, and then tier 1 is like a bunch of like different types of good decks. I think Warhaven is like tier 1, but essentially the reason why I'm saying 0, 0.5, and 1 and then you ignore Ramp Dragon, is because when you play a deck that's notably worse than these 7, it's really, really obvious because it feels really hard to win in this current meta if you're not playing like a tier 1 or above deck. But the difference between tier 0.5, the difference between tier 0 and tier 0.5 is pretty obvious because every deck in tier 0.5 has like an obvious counter to it. And then tier 1, obviously Wardhaven counters Carbuncle Roach and does very well again. Or actually, yeah, Wardhaven just counters Carbuncle Roach and with good draw can beat every other deck in the game. But the issue is that Artifact Portal and Midrange will beat Wardhaven if they draw better than them. And also, they do have a decent matchup into Aggro Sword and Hybrid Rune if they draw somewhat good. But these 2 decks will crush all these 3 decks if the draw RNG is not the same. So that's why it's like tier 0, tier 0.5, because these decks can still win, but it's not as favored. Whereas these 2 decks are super favored against these 3 decks. And then all 5 of these decks are, well, again, excluding Carbuncle Roach, these 4 decks are favored against Wardhaven, but Wardhaven does have a chance of beating all of these, and then this matchup is just cursed. So moving on to Artifact Portal. Artifact Portal got a lot of new toys with the new set. I think, again, this is just me like spitballing a list, so I don't know how real Artifact Portals feel, but I'm personally going to drop Orcus and Odin down to 2 copies just to fit in all the other good cards. Again, because of the prevalence of Aggro Abyss and because of the prevalence of Sword, I do feel like you have to have early game through release and have more 2-drops than you otherwise want to play, just so you don't die for fun early on. But then after that, you'll still have stuff like Artifact Catapult, Miriam, Owlette, Karula for the mid-game, where you're either going to heal a lot, or stall a lot, or board queue a lot, and then your finishers will be Orcus or Odin's to help you push the last bit of damage if you use beta spam, or obviously Ralmia herself with beta spam works as well. So Artifact is pretty much the same deck as last set. It's been treated the same as Roach, in my opinion, whereas Roach basically got no new toys or like very small amounts of bumps in efficiency. Artifact Portal is a little better than Roach off. It is a little bit better off than Roach is because Artifact Portal and Roach were already, well, Roach was better, but Artifact Portal wasn't super far behind. It was just a little bit behind. But now they have way better card draw with Flight of Icarus. If you manage to play this on an appropriate card, this draws you like 3+ cards per game if you draw it on curve. Carnelia ends up making Artifact Cannon really good. But I guess I'm not playing Doomright's Resurgence, so Carnelia isn't as good. Like I could take out 2 Odins for double Doomlight Resurgence, and it probably makes it like a little bit better. But that's only if you get quote unquote unlucky with Carnelia or with your Owlette and Karula timings. And obviously Carnelia, worst comes to worst, if you have Artifact Catapult and Carnelia and like Elise with the Artifact Recharge, you can cheese out one of your early 5-drop artifacts with Carnelia and have it stick to the board with Artifact Catapult, which obviously is very nice because that's a way to get an artifact out on turn 5 without needing Owlette or Karula in hand with a coin. Miriam's still included because she gives the most efficient artifact tokens, and then Bolt from Beyond. You unfortunately still have no good way to deal with stuff like Angrea on curve, so Bullet from Beyond is literally your only answer to those sort of things. And then Owlette, really strong. Karula, I don't know why people keep claiming that Karula is weak because he doesn't give parts. Because every time Karula is played on curve with either Super Evo or non-Super Evo, he feels really oppressive because you have to kill him. Because if you don't kill him and they Super Evolve, they get to deal 16 damage in one turn. So obviously no parts, but he's a very good vanilla turn 6 vanilla play, and he's a threat that has to be responded to. So he's essentially Owlette without the parts and without the Evo cost because you have to kill him and he gives an artifact out. Odin, I think, is really overtuned, but he's probably the most flex spot here. He is taking up a 3rd Orcus slot and Doomright Resurgence and other things, but I think Odin is still very good with artifacts because you can clear really big minions that you might have trouble with without Orcus and Bullet from Beyond. So I think he is valuable in that regard. And then Orcus is just Orcus. Ironically, I have her at less because you have way more artifact support with Ralmia now. But Orcus is still very efficient. It's just that you have more Super Evo targets with like Odin and Karula. So value with Orcus might not be as consistent as it was before. And then Ralmia is just Ralmia. You're going to play her 3 copies of any artifact deck, period. So Carbuncle Roach, in my opinion, has really, really fallen from grace. Every other deck in the game has gotten insanely significant support, but Carbuncle Roach still has the shenanigans of doing 100 from 0, or 20 from 0, or 0 from 20, whatever you want to call it. The list is pretty much exactly the same in my opinion. I know that Dion is experimenting a lot, so I actually don't know what the optimal Carbuncle Roach is, because Dion has the habit of just making changes every stream to have new content. So what the real optimized Roach list probably won't ever be revealed until there's an actual tournament with stuff on the line, just because he is more willing to be creative as opposed to win a lot more, which is probably good for Force players in this meta because of how frustrating the upper end of the meta is. But yeah, if you played Roach before, it's going to be the exact same thing, more or less. I've swapped out some of the old tech card spaces for one Gardens of Lair, one Lamaga, and two Titanias. Titania is pretty nice with Force because it gives you guaranteed fairies if you manage to play her on curve, and she's obviously kind of like the only way you have a chance versus Artifact, or my bad, Wardhaven, because if you get her to respond to Wilbert and they don't have Aether, Titania saves you a lot of hurt, and then maybe you can cheese out a win. Otherwise, Titania is just a very alright minion to play just because of the resource generation. But in case you get the extra Titania, you have the one Guardian's Alert to, you know, get rid of her if you need to. Otherwise, it's the exact same thing. Like, Lamaga is your new Olivia, or your new Olivia, where she's like your 7-drop to stall out the game a little bit. But instead of being exactly like Olivia, she deals like slightly more damage or boardwalks your opponent occasionally. But otherwise, you're just doing the Carbuncle super giga turn with the caveat that with everyone else being more power crept, you can't stall for nearly as long, so you do have to just draw better or pray they break even harder than last set. The last deck I would say in tier 1 or tier 0.5 is Control/Aggro, or Control/Midrange Abyss. I don't really know what the major difference is, because whenever people say they're playing Control Abyss or Midrange Abyss, to my untrained eye, they literally look the exact same. So I'm assuming that Control Abyss just plays Reaper's Death Slash, but I put it in Midrange Abyss for some reason. But yeah, Abyss players will know better than me what the difference is, but as someone watching or experiencing it for themselves, I cannot tell you the difference between Control and Midrange at all. But basically, Midrange Abyss has gotten a lot more threats and a lot more efficiency. With the new set, Ghastly Sori, Vuela, Charon, like these 3 cards gives Abyss a lot more card efficiency. So if you watch games from last set, you would notice that Abyss had the tendency to like have a really small hand late game because they would play less efficient cards turn by turn. But with Ghastly Sori, with Vuela, with Charon, what ends up happening is that now they have much more card efficiency, so they actually hold on. They don't have to play Ruby anymore because they don't need the cycle as bad. They can play Ghostly Sori, which is almost it's like very consistently like a 1-for-3 trade up, which doesn't really matter in this game because a lot of decks that are quote unquote good either have equal 1-for-3 efficiency, aka Sword, or they have insane card draw and cycling, aka Rune and Forest. So it being a 1-in-3 isn't as major as it sounds like in any traditional card game, but it's just more of like the way you can keep your hand and keep the efficiency in your hand instead of having to play it out. Vuela being a really nicely statted minion obviously helps with your mid-range aspect, and then you have Odin to close out the game, gives you a lot of damage, and then you have Gensetsu and Yuzuzuki, who end up giving you a lot of power later on because of how they work. You don't have to Super Evo them, so after you've burned Super Evo on everything else, you still have a lot of threat and power because you can either summon a bunch of minions or you can execute a lot of minions and restore 4 health. Now, the reason why this deck isn't even close to tier 0 is because of the hybrid Rune matchup. I watched a bunch of games, and because Midrange Abyss is mostly like a value and then slowly pokes you down to then kill you with Odin and Cerberus repeatedly, what ends up happening is that against stuff like Rune, they just like nothing, like you can't get damage to stick, and then because you don't get damage to stick, they eventually Cositis, climb, and one-shot you, and that's really frustrating for Abyss players. So I do think Midrange Abyss or Control Abyss is a very good deck, but because Hybrid Rune is so popular and so insanely favored, they're naturally just lower. Like, I think Midrange Abyss is now even to favored with Carbuncle because they have way more threats, whereas in the past, you could just like die to Carbuncle really easily. But now Carbuncle has to evo a lot more to deal with your threats, and whereas in the past, you just kind of like ignored it for fun. Wardhaven is the only true tier 1 deck in my opinion, because while it does have an extremely favored encounter through Forest, every other deck seems to kind of low-key beat it through other means. So if you ever watched people playing Wardhaven, or you watch people play Aggro Abyss, it's really funny watching the Wardhaven player lose because the Aggro Abyss player just kills them before they even drop Wilbert, which happens way more consistently than I think it should. because Wardhaven's ward minions aren't even that scary without the Wilbert buff or the Aether Super Evo effect. So Wardhaven is good against more tempo oriented decks, to be fair, but because it lacks healing, all the damage you deal to Wardhaven early on will almost always stick, with the exception of Salefa healing, which isn't that great. And that ends up causing Wardhaven to like fall behind against decks that can clear them with like more interesting ways. So like again, Aggro Abyss just does more damage than Force would. So one Odin with Evo is enough to kill, or Rage of Serpents. Aggro Sword, again, same idea. Like they can stick a board a lot more easily than Force can, and then they play Odin. And then after the Odin, they have like more stuff that could execute things like Rose can kind of cheese out some clears. You can kind of cheese out direct damage with Tentacles. You can cheese out like a board clear with Albert into one final swing into the head. So it doesn't, like, against other aggro decks that aren't named Forest, they have ways to get around the fat stats of Haven a lot more easily. But then against stuff like Hybrid Rune, like stalling the game out doesn't actually help you, because Hybrid Rune again has the Cositis Climb aspect, and you have to have Lapis against that deck, because otherwise you have no way of clearing the board. Like, you only have so many Odins, but against Hybrid Rune, they just heal your Odin damage. So the only way you're winning against something like Rune is by having Wilbert into Aether, into they can't clear everything somehow because they missed William, into Jean, and then killing them there. So again, that's why it's tier 1 and not lower, because it does have win cons against these better decks, and it's not, it is losing against a lot of the good decks, but it's not like they have no chance. They do have a chance, and that lets it be tier 1. Ramp Dragon is like the freshest. Like, I think Aggro Dragon, just as a by the by, is probably tier 1. I think it's like tier 0.75 because it gets the same privilege of Aggro Abyss, where it's like aggro and it's really fast. So it's just like, oh, like I cycle through the game fast anyways, so it doesn't matter how bad the deck is as long as I approach like a 49% win rate overall. I think Aggro Abyss is probably like it's above 50% win rate overall, but Aggro Dragon is like a little lower than 50%. But again, because it's super fast, it's like a little better than Ramp Dragon. Ramp Dragon is a deck that, again, low-key loses to Hybrid Rune if you don't get lucky, because you just get out-ramped. And against every other deck in the game that has early tempo, you have to get lucky to draw your early tempo on time, and then draw into your things that like let you stabilize, like Neptune. So for example, like as Ramp Dragon, like if you can brick really easily because you're running so many high cost cards. If you brick against aggro decks, you just lose. Or on the other side, like let's say you draw all of your early cards early, but then you don't draw Neptune, and you draw like double Genesis Dragon, you can also lose in that scenario. And you'll notice that I don't have Fenny in here. I think you could probably argue you can take out an Odin. You can take out an Odin and a Searing Fire Newt for 2 Fennies just to help out your late game against certain things. But I was watching some guy talk about Ramp Dragon. He said that Fenny was a little overrated because you just die too quickly usually. So there's a aspect of Ramp Dragon you can play where you discard the Super Greed, which is Fenny, and you have a more stable early game, so you can actually live and play the game 2-player high-cost minions. Or there's other philosophy where you just say, screw it, I don't care, I just want to ramp and have big fat minions cost 3 mana each, which is where you just like cut out Searing Fire Newt and put in 3 Fenny, and then your early game will be significantly weaker. However, you'll probably have more fun because you have way more stuff to play if you do hit. And yeah. If the decks aren't on here, then I don't really have an opinion on them, or they're just probably tier 1 and below. But I guess this is a TLDR. The best ladder deck, specifically in the game right now, is Aggro Abyss by a insanely wide margin. The best objective deck, in my opinion, I think it's pretty close between Aggro Sword and Hybrid Rune. I think the best deck, period, is probably Hybrid Rune, just because of the amount of like versatility and raw. Like, it's just the issue with Hybrid Rune, I guess the best way to put it is that Hybrid Rune is the peak of late game and has the best resources in the entire deck or in the entire game to stall out for that late game. So not only does it win every single late game possible, it's also the deck that has the best way to get that late game no matter what. And because Earthright Rune, which is a more tempo version of Rune, exists, people can't even mulligan to greed out against you to get a one-shot in earlier, because if they mulligan for full greed and then they end up playing as Earthright Rune, they just lose instantly. So every deck will be forced to mulligan for early game against every deck. And a lot of decks that they emulate for only early game, if Hybrid Rune has the answers to all that early game, they just peter out and Hybrid Rune will win naturally. The only reason why Aggro Sword, in my opinion, is a little worse objectively than Hybrid Rune is because they can run out of steam, and a lot of decks are teched against like massive damage slaps, and so there is the very, very small chance, because this deck doesn't run draw at all besides Rose, so you are playing what you get essentially with this deck. So there are scenarios where you aren't able to draw into your Albert to finish them off. You aren't able to draw into Odin to deny a taunt to finish them off. You aren't able to draw like maybe let's say that you only get early game, but then you continue drawing like Zirconia when you really want like Odin or Gildaria or Tentacles, right? So the consistency of Aggro Sword is on paper a little better than Hybrid Rune, but I think the actual consistency of Hybrid Rune is way higher because of their raw draw power, and Aggro Sword is stronger, or is as strong, if not a little stronger, but because you can actually break really hard, it makes it slightly weaker, so it's very interchangeable. Like, these two decks are definitely the best decks, very, very noticeably the best decks in the set, if you consider like actual objective strength. And it's really not that close. Like, I genuinely think that if a Sword player or a Hybrid Rune player tells you that their deck is not number one, they're just flat out lying through the teeth. Because I think either of these people, like, if two people told me these decks were number one, I believe them, and I'll just say they're tied. And then tier 0.5, again, they're still more than good enough to contest these two decks, but there are obvious holes, such as Artifact Portal. Your early game isn't that powerful. Like, it's like okay, but you have to top deck your early game, and you can get outpaced by aggro decks and just die if you don't get lucky with outlets and Karula and like your stabilization, or if they get too lucky, you can't stabilize on time. Roach still has the shenanigans of OTKing you for fun. Midrange Abyss has insane value, and also like very like, it's not Hybrid Rune sustain, but it's still very good sustain and can control you really well, and it can fish out a lot of efficiency and then just kill you with raw card power. And then same thing with Wardhaven, and then Ramp Dragon obviously is a thing. So hopefully this tier list video went a little longer than it probably should have, but I hope it makes sense. And if you guys disagree with any of my takes, just let me know and I will maybe address them because I will be out of the country for a little while. And so yeah, hope you guys enjoyed the video. See you guys next time. Have a good day or night wherever you are, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye bye.